My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
This episode is brought to you by GM Genuine Parts and AC Delco. Get the most out of your vehicle with GM Genuine Parts and AC Delco original equipment. The only parts designed, engineered, tested, and backed by General Motors. You can find your perfect fit for most makes and models and choose from 3 tiers of parts, including GM OE or gold and silver aftermarket parts. Visit gmparts.com for more information.
This episode is brought to you by Loom by Atlassian. Are you feeling stuck at work? Get your team unstuck with Loom video messaging and move work forward. Use Loom to simultaneously record both your screen and yourself to share a quick update, provide feedback, train a colleague, and everything in between. Plus, add Loom AI to your meetings for instant written notes and recordings. Try Loom today at Loom.com. That's LOOM.com.
Order can be frightening, it could be tyrannizing, but you need a requisite of order before you can have full freedom.
I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, a show where we look for historical parallels to better understand our current age of the global enduring disorder. It's also a show where once in a while we stumble across novel and yet explanatory parallels, like the idea that the problems of Weimar Germany have in fact now gone global. And sometimes we even get to interview world-famous scholars who've come up with these novel parallels and have brilliantly extracted useful kernels about the interconnectivity of different crises. Disorder is also a show where we love to read poignant quotes such as, "Once more, empires arise out of chaos, but their weakening and disillusion give way to new forms of chaos. History grants no solution to this dilemma." Wow, poignant stuff. How lucky we are to be joined today by its author, one of my intellectual idols, Robert Kaplan. He's a New York Times bestselling author whose famous books, Balkan Ghosts, The Coming Anarchy, The Arabists, and The Revenge of Geography, have been extremely influential in my own intellectual development, and which may explain why the enduring disorder paradigm formulated from 2018 to 2020 shares so many features with Kaplan's most recent book, Wasteland, A World in Permanent Crisis. This is really one of the groundbreaking books of 2025, so I'm honored to be bringing it to the mega orderers via our new partnership with the New Books Network. Robert, welcome to Disorder.
It's a great pleasure to be here with you, Jason. Really, thanks for that introduction. It was very flattering.
As I've done with George Monbiot, when I really want to feature a book that's moved me, I like to treat it sequentially to unfurl its argument like an onion, get to the core of it, and to do so by peppering the pod with illustrative quotes. You write, "The more abject the disorder, often the more extreme the tyranny to follow." And that brings us to Weimar's last chapter. This really resonates with me. It's been nearly a decade I've been writing about Orban, Putin, the Ayatollahs, and the neo-populists inside the West. To me, they strew disorder without any specific objective. My belief is that by trying to cause civil wars in the global South, they want to push migrants into the global North. And they know that this will give rise to the neo-populists and then tyranny. 2 questions to get us started. If von Pappen's House of Cards was meant to collapse, to what extent can Obama or Biden be credited with weakening U.S. institutions so that in fact they've been very ripe for destruction by the Doge?
Well, first of all, a lot of people could challenge my analogy with Weimar, but my answer is The differences between Weimar and today are legion, but the similarities are intriguing. And Weimar, as I stress in the book, did not have to end with Hitler. It wasn't ordained that it ended that way. If you didn't have a bunch of people who are equally in over their heads and superficial at the right time, at the right place, Hitler never would have come to power. So when I make this analogy with Weimar, I'm not predicting that the world is going to fall into totalitarianism. What's interesting about Weimar in its last days is how nobody was really in control. Despite all the flowering of the arts and literature and architecture and the great statesmen like Walter Rathenau and Stresemann and even Bruning, the economist, with all of that, there was not the requisite order. And that's the theme of my book, that order comes before freedom, because without order, there's no freedom for anybody, essentially. And when we look at our world today, I can see your point that elements of Clinton, Obama led to Trump in indirect ways. I would put the Trump phenomena, which now includes Doge, as I would ascribe it to the following factors. First of all, Trump is the revenge of globalization, because globalization, rather than unite the world, split the United States population, as well as Hungary's, as well as France's and others, into two halves, a kind of globalized, cosmopolitan, upper middle class, wine-sipping half that got swept up into the global world, and the other half, which for various reasons could not compete. They were in the flyover states where the global elite would never be caught dead in, essentially, would never send their children to Nebraska or Kansas. Better they go to Paris or Rome or someplace like that, even though they're American citizens, So that's one thing, globalization. The other thing is the way over the decades, really, the very process of globalization transferred good-paying manufacturing jobs from the United States to China and many other countries. There was nothing to do about this. It was a world of free trade. The growth was spectacular. And when growth is spectacular, it's also very uneven. Some people do much worse than others. And then there was automation, which nobody writes about, which isn't just today, but from 20 years ago has been killing jobs. So that life was not good for a large number of Americans. Then there's the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, of course, but I would call them supporting actors in the Trump phenomena. The main actor was how globalization, kind of ruined the working class lives of people.
This is the somewhere versus nowhere argument, the people of somewhere and the people of nowhere. And all the way back in episode 3, speaking to my mentor, Jonathan Weiner, he was sketching out for us how this could be seen as a slow-moving train. Going all the way back to the Clinton era, we didn't address properly those who had lost out from globalization. What I want to say looking back, though, is why is it that on the center left, if we go in the States and we're speaking about Clinton and Obama, or even including the center right in Europe, meaning the Camerons of the world, they didn't produce more robust institutions. Because for me, the Weimar parallel is interesting, not those things that we all know, but that our institutions have been so weak. Brexit simply destroyed them. Do you know what I mean? When Dominic Cummings said, I'm just going to break the FCDO, he's broken it, and it's still broken. From my perch here in London, looking at this stuff, I don't see USAID or the FAA coming back. I see they're going to be broken, and it's going to be like in Britain, 10 years later, they're still not going to be able to make policy. Why were these things found so hollowed out?
I think it had to do with the end of the Cold War. The Cold War enforced a certain amount of discipline on policymakers and institutions. Our Cold War presidents in the United States were of a much higher caliber overall than our post-Cold War presidents, with individual variations, you might say. And so it was a leadership decline, it was an institutional decline, and institutions lost their way. However, let me say, as someone who wrote a biography of someone who worked his whole life for USAID, that there was nothing wrong with AID that a tough, moderate, center-right Republican businessman type could not have fixed. He would have gone down the list of projects with a red pencil and axed out about 10 of them. This too crazy or marginal. And this is what presidents did. Ronald Reagan had a great AID director from the business community, M. Peter McPherson. So did George W. Bush and Andrew Natsios and others. You know, the normal thing is for a Republican president to say, I don't like the direction AID is going. I need someone from the business community to really fix it.
I think you point out the advantage of the pendulum of power, which is that if it's swinging at a small amplitude, you benefit from the corrections when it swings in the opposite direction. The problem is that our pendulum of power, you know, from Corbynistas and Ilhan Omar on one side, swings all the way to Dominic Cummings and Elon Musk on the other. So, next quote. You write, in truth, order must come before freedom, because without order, there is no freedom for anyone. And I have said so many times in this podcast, I think we need order to have human thriving, even if there are some baked-in injustices in that order. Would you say that you're a Hobbesian like me?
I remember Hobbes, in his own mind, and in the mind of real experts about him, was an idealist. He was sort of a liberal idealist because he thought his Leviathan, his state, his kingdom, would be able to bring order and solve a lot of problems of daily life, because he had been horrified at the disorder he had seen in his own lifetime in Britain and France and other places. So I don't consider Hobbes a pessimist. I think Hobbes understood that if you created the right order, human beings could thrive. And that's really where I'm coming from. I think in the times we live in today, Hobbes is incorrectly looked upon as a doom and gloom pessimist by people who will say are who know a bit about him, but not a lot about him, kind of. And he's, because there's this obsession with promoting democracy, exporting democracy, all of that, and what's wrong with a little bit of disorder if we have to create democracy? Well, the people who say that have never experienced anarchy the way I have in Iraq and Sierra Leone and other places, and like other foreign correspondents have. For them, anarchy and chaos are just fancy words that they use when things are not going perfectly. But what Hobbes was talking about was real anarchy, which was far, far worse than other things.
I think that's brilliantly put. Obviously, nothing made me more conservative than the years I lived in Syria and Libya. So you've really encapsulated that. And
yeah,
I love how in the book you explain that Samuel Huntington grasped that America was great because of its institutions and traditions even more than its ideals. And this is the lowercase c conservatism. And you explain well in Wasteland how and why Weimar's institutions failed. And I want to highlight one, I think, instructive parallel that I'd like to hear more of your thoughts on.
Okay, sure.
Weimar produced some artistic flowering, but it couldn't think strategically. But more than that, its institutions were not robust enough to put a putschist like Hitler in jail for a long period of time over his beer hall putsch in Munich. What does this parallel show us about how and why Biden's America was unable to put Clarence Thomas and Trump in jail for January 6th?
This is where I talk about how if you just had the institution of ceremonial monarchy, constitutional monarchy, it would have put more seriousness into the Weimar Republic. The very fact that someone like Hitler, who tried to overthrow the government, is put in jail for just a few months and kept in luxurious conditions where he could write a book, showed the weakness and the divisions
But
within
why?
the people.
I think a lot of listeners won't know enough about Weimar to understand. A lot of the times when a country is failing, they put people in jail and they throw away the key. Why were the Weimarian authorities not able to crack down on someone who wished them ill?
Not only because they were divided, but because they lacked confidence. Remember, Germany had just lost a war, a catastrophic war. Millions were killed. The Hohenzollern monarchy was disbanded. Remember what Churchill said, I quoted in the book, had the Hohenzollerns and the Wittelsbachs and the Habsburgs been allowed to stay on their throne, if only in a symbolic way, Hitler never would have come to power. That's why I defend monarchy in the book, constitutional monarchy, obviously, though it's not constitutional in the Arabian Gulf, and it still works quite well compared to Libya, Syria, places where you live. But there was basically lack of confidence and weak institutions in Weimar that led to what it led to.
And what does this tell us, this parallel with Biden's America being unable to put Clarence Thomas, even get him off the bench and get Trump in jail? Like, it seemed like this was the biggest open goal in history.
Yeah.
How was this open goal missed? I don't even myself understand the answer.
Yeah. Remember, America is not as severe a condition as Weimar. Just like Donald Trump is not a fascist, he's not serious enough to be a fascist. He's not focused enough to be a fascist. Fascists have programs. They have step 1 to step 2 to step 3. Trump is very episodic. He loses interest, he regains interest, all of that. I think Biden's was a very weak presidency, not just in that regard, but in others too. And I guess I can ascribe it to his age. There was just not a lot of effort and oomph in his presidency. You didn't see the president as strongly in control. I'm sure he subordinated a lot of decisions to aides, and when you subordinate crucial decisions to aides just follow the lowest common denominator. They don't want to take risks. And when there are never any risks, you have a weak presidency.
Now, pushing a little bit more here, Merrick Garland, obviously he should have been on the Supreme Court rather than being the AG. But by all accounts, a very well-intentioned man, a great legal thinker. How is it that he could face this dossier and not get one of the things over the line? And then at the states, both in Georgia and New York, where they're just sitting on these unbelievably strong cases to only get him for hush money for a porn star. I don't get that. Please help me explain that, because maybe the history can teach us something.
Okay, I'm not an expert on the American legal system, but what I know is the American legal system has evolved so much, it's easy for it to be gamed by smart and slick lawyers. It is true that the rich get a different kind of justice than the poor do in many ways. And government lawyers who work 9 to 5 at low pay are nothing compared to lawyers that the private sector or someone like Trump can hire with his own money. We see that in so many ways in the United States, where there's not a uniform, fair system of justice because of the way it's been infiltrated. And this is true with the American system in general, the way it's been infiltrated by money. And the very tableau, the photographic tableau of the Trump inauguration, of the proximity of hundreds of billions of dollars distributed among
Trillions. You mean
trillions,
literally trillions.
Trillions distributed among 6 individuals in that photo op, right next to the president, able to whisper in his ear. There's American politics have always been infiltrated by money. That's nothing new. But it's the attrition of the same and the intensification of the same that adds up to big change.
Sticking with your being a Habesian, I think it's worthwhile pointing out that on the Disorder Show, you're speaking to a majority British audience with something like 75% of our listeners in the Commonwealth. And we completely buy the argument that the figurehead of constitutional monarchies is actually significant for the trajectory of the society. And that if you look at Canada and the UK, in comparison to the republics of France and America, you're going to have a wider swing of the amplitude of the pendulum in a pure republic. Yeah. And a smaller swing with the corrective of monarchy. Can you share more of your thinking and help us who really like this principle, but we don't understand it, how it works? Could you explain to us how does it actually work?
Well, think what Britain would be like with no monarchy. There would be no sirs, no Royal Institute of this, no Royal Institute of that, no awards at the end of the year given out by Buckingham Palace. All these things are very symbolic, and they could get a little bit silly, but they matter. They deeply, deeply matter because they create a buy-in to the system. There's something mystical about it, something magical about it, because it's not fully logical, and that's not a criticism. And therefore, it leads people to be more serious in politics, because politicians come and go, but kings and queens can stay on the throne for decades and bless both conservative governments and liberal governments. It adds a form of stability to the whole system and a raison d'etre to the system. And I think that works well in Scandinavia as well. We think of Scandinavian monarchies as so boring, we don't know much about them. But for the people that live there, they matter.
One might argue that they matter more because they're less corrupt. Here, of course, there is the extent to which the royals eat off the public purse. And if you look at the Scandinavian and Dutch monarch traditions, they don't even eat much from the public purse. They merely do the cultural things that you're talking about.
And they're working monarchies.
100%.
They have professions,
I think your cultural argument is very strong. I'll put forth a structural one, and then I want to move beyond this. Structurally, the Queen could have, used the Queen in Parliament theory to revoke Article 50. And I advocated for that because I think that the vote for Brexit was not binding. It was an indicative vote. They didn't compel the government to do the Brexit, and it's certainly not a hard Brexit. That wasn't even a part of the vote. It's true that she didn't do it, but the mere fact that she could have, I think, constrains even how a Boris Johnson or a Liz Truss behaves. So I think that that's structural, that the power does actually, although it isn't exerted, lie elsewhere is critical. So given the purity of the American Republic and how unconstrained it is, isn't it a bit of a miracle that it's lasted for 250 years? I mean, the French are on their fifth republic, and every cataclysm from the Franco-Prussian War to Vichy, they get onto another republic. Even Algeria pushed them onto another republic. Are my kids or your kids going to experience the third American Republic? Are we going to get another republic when we're done with this fiasco?
It's amazing. There are two miracles in the times we live in, historical miracles. One is that the American Republic has lasted as long as it did. Also, that NATO and the post-war Atlantic Alliance has lasted as long as it has. We've gone through a technological revolution on all levels, an identity revolution on all levels, a sexual revolution on many levels. And yet NATO stands after 80 years and the American Republic stands after 250 odd years, which is amazing.
Maybe our string of good luck might be coming to an end, though.
Yes. Well, that's one of the things that I think about often, because the one lesson of history, and this is so basic, is that nothing lasts forever. And I think what helped the American Republic was, for most of its existence, from Tom Paine to Dwight Eisenhower or Kennedy, we lived in the print and typewriter age. And the print and typewriter age was very friendly to moderate, in the middle, centrist thinking of a complex sort, because that's what journalism did. You cannot imagine someone like Donald Trump outside of the digital video age. You just can't. And now that the media is less serious, because to me, social media is about passion, and passion is the enemy of analysis, and usually the enemy of good government. Yet social media dominates Washington. Even the think tank people are all on Twitter, or X, whatever. To me,
it's the only way to get promoted. The only way to
become
become senior management is to get 10 or 20,000 Twitter followers.
Yeah, and to me, this is decadence. The American Republic is slipping into decadence, and it has a personification, Donald Trump.
And maybe from Ibn Khaldun to Spengler, who you both write about, decadence is just the normal human order of things. And why should we be any different? Why should we not succumb to the same pressures that the Umayyads and the Roman Empire fell prey to? I think that there are so many contingencies at play, and that this is something that you grasp very well. I wrote about 5-7 years ago in my book, Libya and the Global Enduring Disorder, that the implosion of the Syrian and Libyan states and the flood of migrants that they released were needed for Brexit. And that the killing of my friend, Ambassador Chris Stevens, on September 12th, 2012 in Benghazi was essential for Trump's rise. A few more moments before the break, what do you see as the key underappreciated contingencies that have gotten us to this moment? It wasn't all foreordained, and that's another parallel between Weimar and now. There were contingencies.
Right, yeah.
So what are the contingencies that you'd like to highlight?
Right. As I point out in another book, it's all about vast impersonal forces until it's suddenly all about Shakespeare, in terms of contingencies. One was the Florida recount, because I think had Al Gore become president, he still would have invaded Iraq, but it would have been carried out very, very differently.
And this one is so critical that when we had Sean Willents on in literally episode 3 and Timothy Garden Ash in episode 1, and that's what they said is the key moment where everything pivoted. Both of them at the very beginning have said our era of disorder began with what's called the Brooks Brothers riot. Stop the count, stop the count.
So, that's one thing. Of course. And that ricocheted into why Jeb Bush failed. Because had George W. not become president, Jeb Bush might have been elected over Trump, because one of the things against Jeb Bush was his brother, keep in mind. So it all would have been different. In terms of the big economic effects, globalization, I'm finding it difficult to find a Shakespearean moment. That has a lot to do with processes, But certainly the Florida recount was pivoted the country on a different direction.
After the break, Robert and I return, and we look at West Africa, his experiences there, and how that microcosm can shed a little bit of light on where we are today.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
How does PwC take your company to the leading edge? They bring the sharpest minds in tech to your team, so you can bring the ideas that will transform your business. They're passionate about your industry, so you can walk into any room with every advantage. And they're with you every step of the way, so you can know you're headed in the right direction. PwC builds for what's next, so you can get there now. Get started at pwc.com/us/leading edge.
Jif peanut butter. It's that tiffing good, it doesn't really need advertising. So instead, enjoy the calming sounds of the ocean. Jiff. Ooh, it's that jiffing good. Get your Jiff at jiff.com.
We're back from the break with Robert Kaplan. And we said that we would mix up the standard disorder approach and maybe talk some culture. So you write about Solzhenitsyn and when he was in Vermont and the kind of traditionalism, shall we say Burkean conservatism, that he brought to bear on his thinking. Could you tell us a little bit more about his insights into the traditional Russian need for hierarchy? How did he view Lenin? And how can you draw lessons from Solzhenitsyn for our time?
Yes. Well, Jason, Solzhenitsyn to me is more than a great writer. He's one of the great men of the 20th century. Imagine this. He won a Nobel Prize in Literature and had to leave the Soviet Union. And rather than settle in New York or Paris, where he'd be feted at one dinner party after another, he settled in the most rural part of rural Vermont and spent the better part of 2 decades alone just writing. It's really in the best tradition of Eastern Orthodox monasticism, essentially. And what did he write? He wrote the Red Wheel series, which is still being translated into English. It's a whole number of big fat books that very few people read. You know, most people read the Gulag Archipelago or some of his other books, but they don't read this series. And this series has a number of great lessons for our time. First of all, Solzhenitsyn believes that it was the earlier 1917 revolution, the February Revolution, I think, that was the enduring tragedy, in his words, more than the October Revolution of 1917 that brought Lenin to power. Because the February Revolution brought anarchy. It brought to power Alexander Kerensky, who is a brilliant orator, a brilliant thinker, but he had no real political skills. And the result was that the system just eroded. You know, it just collapsed. And for Solzhenitsyn, Russia was always a weak state, weakly institutionalized across 11 time zones. And it was held together by a thread. And the moment you cut that thread, you unleash the most wildest forces. And that's the enduring anarchy. You know, the Tsar may have been corrupt, he may have been anti-Semitic, he may have been weak, he may have been just completely unfit for his job. But the fact is, he was the Tsar. And had the royal family stayed in power, Russia might have evolved into a somewhat corrupt, somewhat inefficient, normal state in Europe, rather than the Bolshevik monster that killed tens of millions of people. Solzhenitsyn is telling us that it was the earlier anarchy which literally left power in the streets for a small group of Bolsheviks to pick up. And the lesson of all this is that anarchy is worse than tyranny. Tyranny, people can figure out solutions to, figure out how to behave, how to dress, what to say, what not to say in order to survive. But there's no behavior pattern that helps you survive anarchy. What really shook me was Iraq. Was anarchy in Iraq, because Iraq was a developed state. It had superhighways, it had, shopping malls, it had all of that stuff. And because I could not imagine anarchy in a place like Iraq, the fact of it and what I saw later there shook me.
So you write the most benighted parts of West Africa were a microcosm, albeit in exaggerated form, of the turmoil to come across the globe. And essentially, as you've just said, Iraq and wealthier places that were more plugged into the global economy, like my famous Libya, to my mind are even more illustrative microcosms because they show what happens when you have those financial and educational webs to sanctions evasion and Russian dark money and things that could never happen in Sierra Leone and Cote d'Ivoire, right?
Exactly. Iraq was caused by an ill-fated invasion. It was an artificial event. And it was the first time that the United States or the West tried to rebuild a complex Islamic society on the ground. So it was a first. So it failed, somewhat forgivable. It was a first. There were no models. But to unleash chaos in Libya was not a first, and was even less forgivable in that sense, because there was the model of Iraq to go on.
Well, I would say it was the opposite mistake. In Iraq, they tried to over-control things from de-Baathification to picking and choosing. And in Libya, they didn't give enough capacity building assistance. So it was that they underchose things and did too little. But we digress.
Yes.
What I found so fascinating, Robert, is that you crystallized for me something that I'd experienced but never realized, which is that everyone is going on and on about the decline of the West, but actually Russia and China are also declining.
Yes.
It's only a question of relative decline. Is it correct that of Russia, China, the US, and Europe, it's that in China the decline is relatively less?
No, I wouldn't say that. I would say the decline is significant in two aspects. For 35 years or so, you had collegial, risk-averse, non-ideological, nominally communist people running the system. And so China had friends all over the world. It was an easy country to do business with. It had the perfect mix of control and freedom in some ways. But now you have a Leninist system, where you have Leninist ideologues making complex financial decisions. And you have, significant amount of money fleeing the country. I think China is eroding, but it's not seen as much. It's because it's under an opaque authoritarian regime, so a lot is hidden. I think that Xi's Leninism may actually be the last phase of communism in China. Remember, the communist system is just the most recent Chinese dynasty, going back thousands of years. And after Xi, you may get a real change. Just look at this. You had Chiang Kai-shek's warlordism, you had Mao's anarchic revolutionary system, you had Deng Xiaoping's Mandarinate, so to speak, and now you have Xi's Leninism. So that China was a different China under each large personality. And there's no reason why China cannot evolve dramatically again after Xi. So I'm not convinced of China's stability. Of course, the real decline I see that's sudden is more in Russia.
In fact, what you've put forward there draws on an amazing episode we had with Zoe Liu of the Council of Foreign Relations, showing how stressing oversupply and all of the loans to bogus exporters and things like this have taken what was good under Deng Xiaoping in capitalism with Chinese characteristics and really gone to a bizarre, irrational, statist bit that doesn't work. And so we're getting to that kind of real decline. In terms of everyone declining, if we look at the world system, you're challenging, I think, some conventional realist thoughts that I also want to challenge. What does it mean if all these states are declining? Is it that non-state actors are more powerful, billionaires like Musk, or is it just that tiny little states like Singapore or not so little states like South Korea are more powerful and the Gulf? How do you see that?
Look, nobody likes great powers and empires. I mean, the whole intellectual world is made up of attacking them, essentially. But the fact is, they order the world and they give some coherence and structure and stability to the world. So the weakening of all the great powers I see is going to lead to a more anarchic system. The BRICS are not going to save us. The BRICS may be united in terms of eventually replacing the dollar as the world currency, for instance. But look, who's a member of the BRICS? The UAE, which is pro-Israel, South Africa, which is anti-Israel. What do Brazil and India have in common geopolitically, geographically, all of that? I think there's a lot less there than meets the eye, that the BRICS are somewhat of a media creation.
Speaking of global order, you write, and I quote from Wasteland, A World in Permanent Crisis, "The Ukraine war demonstrated that there is and has never been a world order or international community. No rules-based system, the more one reflects on it." Now, this is a very powerful quote, and I want to say how so, because when those empires that you talk about, particularly the British one from 1815 to World War I, or the American one from 1946 until roughly 2003, I feel like, reading history and living through some of that, there was a world order. So in what extent was there not one? Because I feel that we are in something new in the degree of this coming anarchy.
Yes, we had a world order during the Cold War. Let's look at Africa. You had a number of states that were tied to the Soviet Union, Angola, Ethiopia, others, and in Ghana at some point, and and a whole bunch of states tied to the West. So the Cold War gave a certain amount of order to the world. As bloody as the Cold War were at the geographical fringes, like Southern Africa or Vietnam, but I think there's much less of that now. There's much less of an ordering mechanism now than there was then.
That's exactly what the enduring disorder paradigm is. And I don't lust for the old days of the Cold War. I don't idealize or romanticize it. I merely think that there was a rationale. A lot of what happens now, there is very little rationale, sadly.
Yeah, and also nowadays you have things because of technology that didn't exist then.
And I want to jump onto that point because you and I are in so much agreement. I had to struggle to find one or two points where we could potentially disagree agreeably. I quote again, "At the end of the Cold War, remember, there was, for all intents and purposes, no internet, no email, no smartphones, no well-established global elite with its influential networks and conferences. None of the things we now take for granted as the staples of our interconnected world." And as I have said repeatedly, I agree with nearly every sentence in this book, but this one confuses me because I experience the past as having more coherent elites, things based on Rhodes scholarships, the old European aristocracies, New England boarding schools, top hedge funds. And now I live in a world where there are less cohesive elites, that you can find yourself at Oxford and you find someone who comes from South Asia and disagrees with your values on this, or the protesters on a Columbia campus can disagree about the very nature of what America's role in the world is. So to what extent is that really true, that we now have more cohesive elites than they did in the past?
Well, I would say that elites in the past were restricted to an aristocratic thin layer to a certain extent. Now globalization has created an entire class. So I think the elites have grown and they've become more interconnected, even if they don't agree with each other. I mean, because of Davos, Bilderberg, and all these other conferences, people are more concerned what the Financial Times says about them than what the Omaha World Herald says about them. And that's new. That's new over the last 50 years. The elites have become denationalized in a way.
That's what the conspiratorialists on the right say about the elites. I just don't agree with that, because the reality is that in the 18th century, Polish elites spoke French and they couldn't even speak Polish. And in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, essentially, you would find elites who claimed to be Slavic, but they would converse in German or Hungarian amongst themselves. So I don't think that we have a more cohesive global elite than we did in the past, because these days, quote-unquote elites might be post-colonialists engaging in PC woke stuff on the one hand, and then burn it down Boris and Dom Cumming Brexiteers on the other. I see a fracturing. I don't see the existence of a global elite.
Well, let me put it this way. The elite was toppled in the last election in America. There was an elite in the sense that the people in the upper reaches of the Biden administration could talk to people at the Munich Security Conference from France and Germany as if they were friends, because they were friends. They were all on a first-name basis. They had gone to the same schools. They had the same values, the same behavior. And this goes down not just to the cabinet level, but way, way down to the sub-cabinet level. So I think the global elite has deepened, and as a result has fractured states right down the middle. And you see that in the United States, where 52% now tyrannize the other 48%. And you see it a bit in Hungary. You saw it in Britain with Brexit. You see it in France, where you have a technocratic elite in power, which knows how to govern, but their values are not accepted by a very large minority there, who, if they were in power, might not know how to govern.
Continuing with your challenging aphorisms, you write, the Soviet military in Afghanistan and the U.S. militaries also in Afghanistan and Iraq were both misused, and these can be seen as audits of whole societies. Wow, I find this very compelling. We all know that Russia is failing in Ukraine and that they didn't conquer Kyiv in 3 days, and that exposed endemic corruption, venality, and centralized groupthink within Putin's polity. What of America, Israel, Hamas, the European defense sector? How have the ongoing wars of the last 3 years been an audit of those entities?
All right. Well, first of all, what was an audit of the Russian invasion of Ukraine was the fact that it was still a communist-style army that had virtually no non-commissioned officer class, unlike the middle-class American army, which did, because it's the sergeants and corporals who give an army its culture and carry out missions. The officers are just an elite who make decisions. So Putin may have done well in Syria and West Africa with elite mercenary-style troops, but the invasion of Ukraine was a major invasion and required an army that, as the saying goes, needed logistics, and had none of it. Absolutely none of it. What I meant was about an army being misused. I've read that elsewhere. Armies are not strategic instruments. They may be great. The generals may impress you. The lieutenants may impress you. The sergeants may impress you. But if they're assigned a mission that is not essentially military, they will fail.
I was wondering about just the audit of what does American or Israeli performance or the European defense sector's performance say about our societies. And I liked your analysis, which is that America's industrial might relative to Europe has really been shown, that, whatever you may say about Northrop Grumman and Raytheon overcharging the Pentagon, and they probably massively do, but they produce goods that actually work, and it's unclear.
Yeah. And there's another defense of Northrop Grumman and Raytheon, which is the kinds of big equipment that the military needs can only be produced by a few companies, because it requires scale and specification and dedicating your whole enterprise of tens of thousands of employees to just producing a limited number of products. It's in the nature of things there that there's not going to be total free market capitalism, and that's going to lead to overcharging, and that's where you get the $500 toilet seats and, all of that kind of stuff. I think that one thing the Israelis have mastered, what we saw in Gaza and in Hezbollah, is technology. in using technology to hunt down people and just to coordinate between platoons and all that. I mean, we're going to learn a lot more about this as books are written about it. But I think they've really mastered technology. What I worry about with Europe is everyone's talking in Europe, oh, we need a bigger military, here's the money, let's build it. Anyone can build a big military, but can you build a military that's willing to kill? That's willing to be aggressive and lethal? Because you could also build a military of chocolate toy soldiers like the UN missions in southern Lebanon. The UN peacekeepers in southern Lebanon who were so feckless that Israel had to invade every few years to set things to rights. So it's not just a question of money. Europe has to be serious that even peacekeepers need to be war makers, or they have to be perceived as war makers in order to be taken seriously and to keep the peace.
So many interesting anecdotes and observations, but please, Robert, order the disorder with me. We like on the Disorder Pod to give actual solutions that policymakers and people can use to try to make the world a better place. What I see around me is that down with the experts is the cry of the mob, and we have what you describe in your book, which is the tyranny of the crowd. And it may be a Twitter mob, or it may be the Twitter mob plus their manipulators. How do we fix this problem? What is it going to take to get the masses to understand the need for experts and the need to trust them and to put government to doing things?
Yeah, I mean, everyone hates experts, but you need them. And the reason you need them is the more complex the world becomes, the more siloed becomes expertise. There's no solution to this. I really honestly think that it's only failure that is going to lead people to respect experts. Because when they try to do things without experts and they manifestly fail, they will see the need for an expert class.
That frightens me. Next one. What will it take to get our European allies to ever trust America again?
It will take not just one, but maybe two or more presidential terms that are normal, where it doesn't oscillate back and forth between one extreme and the other.
What lessons do we learn for how to cope with our current moment by reading thinkers like Eliot, Spengler, and Solzhenitsyn?
What we learn is that order can be frightening, it could be tyrannizing, but you need a requisite of order before you can have full freedom.
What are your silver bullets for British and European centrist policymakers, people like Starmer and Macron? What should they be doing in preparing to deal with all of the threats, be it AI regulation or Ukraine or the inability to trust America?
Anxious foresight. To think constructively, pessimistically, 5 steps ahead of the curve. Because it's what you worry about persistently that often never happens, because you've taken steps to avoid it.
Then, to conclude with a quote, "There was much hope in Weimar, but insufficient order. Avoiding Weimar's fate now constitutes the ultimate labor for the world." Lay out a quick roadmap for us. What can we learn from Weimar? What is this labor that we can undertake?
What we can learn is that literally anything is possible. And when we learn that literally anything is possible can happen to us, we will become more humble and more careful.
And there you have it. Only when things are so broken that people realize that the disorderers have disordered everything will they call back in the experts to do some ordering. In short, my dear mega orderers, Robert Kaplan has shown us that it will get worse before it gets better. Thank you for listening. Of all the pods we've done, maybe this one to me hits me the hardest because of how much I admire Robert Kaplan's work, and his recent book, Wasteland, A World in Permanent Crisis, is just page-turning genius with the most quotable lines on every page. Wow. If you want to find out more about Robert Kaplan, what he writes, my thoughts about it. Please subscribe to our Substack. Also, if you're interested in the New Books Network and our New Books series with them to feature books like Julia Ebner, Harvey Whitehouse's Inheritance, and George Monbiot's amazing book on neoliberalism, please check out the links in the show notes in the Substack about that partnership with New Books Network. As always, our producer has been the one, the only George McDonough. And as I foreshadowed, the Disorder Pod has left the Goalhanger Podcasts network, and we've been very grateful. We were working with the absolute top British independent production company. It launched us, it got us audience, it helped us meet fantastic people, but we are now ready to move on, and we are moving to the Evergreen Podcast Network, which is a medium-sized but growing Cleveland, Ohio-based podcast network, very dynamic, amazing at cross promos, pitching out guests, and I think you're going to like how the show grows and how this helps us grow. If you're already a mega orderer and you listen, you don't need to do anything. This RSS feed is going to continue. If you're just discovering the podcast, welcome to Disorder. We hope you enjoy as we continue to grow and try to bring you more content that helps you order the disorder in co-production with Evergreen Podcasts. I hope you have a very orderly week and that you do not live in the wasteland of global politics.